And these two events today are forming the Illinois Authors Common, where we wanted to connect with and learn from writers within the U of I system. And so before we get started, a number of very important thank yous. This event is part of the Illinois Year, or as we all now know, Years or Decade of Creative Writers, the brainchild of Antoinette Burton. And so thank you so much to Antoinette and Janice Harrington for all of their work making these events possible, all of the wonderful readers that we've been able to have here and other universities, especially in the middle of a pandemic. It's pretty cool that we still get all of these rich opportunities for being able to have authors come. The Year of Creative Writers is sponsored by the Presidential Initiative to celebrate the impact of the arts and the humanities, presented by the Humanities Research Institute and the Creative Writing Program and Department of English. It's co-sponsored by the Institute for the Humanities at UIC, the UIC Program for Writers, UIS Creative Writing, the Champaign Public Library, the Urbana Free Library, Illinois Public Media, and the Illini Union Bookstore. And thank you too to Nancy Castro, Aaron Chichiora, Bob Markley, Ted Sanders, John Dudek, and Sam Blank for all their work and support to make today possible. It's really taking a village with all of these events, and we appreciate your work and time so much. And so just to give you a little idea about how this panel is going to work, Cris and Christina are each going to start by guiding us through their personal publication histories, how they got to where they are today. And then we'll follow that with a conversation about various aspects of publishing before a significant amount of time that's devoted for your own questions about publishing. This afternoon, I'll read these short bios to introduce our authors, with longer introductions being saved for this evening at the reading. So Cris Mazza's new novel, Yet to Come, is from Blaze Vox Books. In 2017, Mazza's Charlatan New and Selected Stories, chronicling 20 years of short fiction publications, was released. Mazza has 17 other titles of fiction and literary nonfiction, including Something Wrong with Her, a real-time memoir, her first novel, How to Leave a Country, which won the Penn Nelson Algren Award for book-length fiction, and the critically acclaimed Is It Sexual Harassment Yet? She's a native of Southern California and is a professor in and director of the Program for Writers at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Christina Pugh's fifth book of poems, Stardust Media, was recently awarded the Juniper Prize for Poetry and published in 2020 from the University of Massachusetts Press. She is also the author of 4 previous books of poems, including Perception from Four Way Books in 2017, which was named one of the best poetry books of 2017 by Chicago Review of Books, and Grains of the Voice, Northwestern University Press 2013. Her poems have appeared in The Atlantic, Poetry, Kenyon Review, Colorado Review, Yale Review, and many other publications. She has been awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship in Poetry, as well as fellowships and awards from the Poetry Society of America, the Illinois Arts Council, the Baliasco Foundation, and others. Her critical writing about poetry and poetics has appeared in many publications such as 20th Century Literature, the Emily Dickinson Journal, and Poetry. She is professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago and was consulting editor at Poetry Magazine through 2020. Before we turn over to them, just can we give a quick round of applause, a welcome, which should be a huge room welcoming you. And so if you don't mind, Cris, starting us off and talking to us about your own personal publication journey, and then we'll turn over to you, Christina.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I liked how you said this when you first said what we were going to be saying, when you said how we got to where we are, because I got to where I am really, really early and then stayed there. After graduate school, I had 2 books of short stories published. One was titled, Is It Sexual Harassment Yet? And it was published 6 months after the Clarence Thomas hearings. So it did get considerable notoriety, you might say. But then but before that ever happened, before the Thomas hearings, my MFA novel manuscript won a national award. It was the Penn Nelson Ogren Award, which no longer exists. And the hopes they had for this award was that it was going to be finding new viable literary novels for the New York publishing industry. And so my manuscript toured the New York publishing industry, and where it was praised, but deemed not commercial enough. So the Nelson Algren Award, I don't know if that's why they stopped having that. So 8 years later, that manuscript, meanwhile, I guess that manuscript won that award before the two short story collections were published. I have that backwards. So it won the award, then two short story collections were published, but that book finally was published 8 years later by a well-known independent press, Coffee House Press. And because of the award and the 8-year journey, it got some considerable amount of attention, reviewed in major newspapers and the New York Times book review. But this was a totally different time than it is now. And major newspapers all had big book sections. And, they regularly were reviewing lots of books. There was, was pre-social media. And so because of the manuscript's history and its journey, excuse me, somebody's making noise behind me. Because of the manuscript's history and its journey, my status was born at that time as an independent press writer. And so since then, I've had 16 more books published from 10 different independent presses. And while I understand later you're going to be asking me about agents, and I have had agents, I am living in a world where I am my own advocate at this point, and that's where I am, and that's where I'm likely to stay. And I don't consider it anything. I don't consider it a step down. It's just a different path.
Thank you so much, Cris. And I'll have some follow-up questions afterwards. But Christina, if you would guide us through yours.
All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, it's just really great to be doing this with Cris Mazza. So I'm very, very grateful about that. Thanks to everyone at UIUC, especially Corey, who's done so much work. Yeah, I have published 5 books of poetry since 2004. My first book was called Rotary, which was published in 2004, which won a first book prize with a small and at the time very new press called WordPress. Since then, I've worked with a few different presses who have published my books. I've published 2 books with Northwestern University Press, 1 book with 4-Way Books in New York, and most recently with the Juniper Prize, the University of Massachusetts Press. So that's all small independent presses, a few university presses, actually a couple university presses in there. And so, a few different publishers and different experiences. Before my first book came out, and this may be of interest to some of the students here who may be at this stage, I also published a limited edition chapbook from a book arts press, which is still one of my most prized possessions, just because the art with which they produced this book was so amazing. It was Wells College Press, and it was in concert with an undergraduate book arts course. And it was called Gardening at Dusk, and it came out a couple years before my first book came out. I do have a PhD in comparative literature, which I completed before I started publishing poetry. And so I've always been this person who publishes in a couple of different genres. I continue to publish a fair number of scholarly articles and also articles for more creative writing, and a little bit more, popularly read articles about poetry and poetics. Um, and so, it's been kind of a whole range of publication venues for these articles. Some are really oriented towards specialists in the field, like, for example, writing for the Emily Dickinson Journal or for 20th Century Literature, as opposed to writing an essay for Poetry Magazine, which I've done many times, that gets a much different kind of audience and a different kind of range. So with essayistic writing, I am really kind of working in a couple, two or three different worlds. Um, I'll say that, I mean, I've mostly talked about books and articles, but of course, like every poet, I also publish individual poems in magazines and journals. So that has been a huge range of publications, ranging from, say, the Atlantic to new online journals like terrain.org, which is a great online journal. And I suppose we'll probably talk, more as this discussion goes on. But I will say, I was nodding my head when Cris was talking about, the years that it took to get that particular manuscript published. We actually had David St. John here this week, which was, amazing. And he was talking to my class, my advanced poetry writing class, about, the same thing of somebody's quote unquote first book of poems that was actually their third book that they had written, because this was the first one that they could get published. It took me 3 years to get a publisher for my first book, 3 years of sending everywhere. And, one thing I do like to tell people is that there are more presses around now than there used to be for poetry. I mean, we keep being told that print publication is dying and this and that. And actually, what I kept seeing in my work for Poetry Magazine over all those years was I'd learn about a new press almost every time I opened my virtual desk to look at what was coming in. There were new presses doing all kinds of interesting work, and that really heartened me. The idea that, we're sort of by the mass media, we're being told, oh, print culture is going away. But what I saw on the ground was just the opposite. And so, I like to tell people, open your minds and look around and see what else is out there. There's a lot more out there than there was when I was trying to publish my book Rotary back in, 2001. But, the other thing I'd say, and I think it's, partly what Cris was emphasizing too, is that publishing is not a static endeavor. Things really change. Editors change, lists change, one's work can change. And so, what was the best publisher for one book may not be the best for the next, and things like that. So it's kind of a constantly evolving challenge in a way. And, that's kind of how I feel about it, is it's constantly something to learn, really. About where your work fits, where it doesn't fit, and how everything is evolving, not just you and your work, but the whole terrain of literary publishing. So, yeah, that's basically it in terms of, where I am, what I've done, and how I'm thinking about things.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I mean, part of the reason when I found out that I could invite you two as part of this, I just thought we have to use both of their experience in all of these different genres with independent presses, prize-winning books, and being able to think about, what is useful for students. I know in my own MFA, like we had to kind of hush talk about publishing on the side, and some professors even telling us actively not to even think about publishing. And so this is something that seems helpful for people to just be able to kind of open the door and have some more access to questions that they
Yeah,
have.
sure.
And so we're so grateful to be able to pick your minds about all of this. And that first, what stands out from both of these journeys, one of the many things, is just how many different genres you're all writing in memoir and short stories and novels, chapbooks, scholarly publications, full-length poetry collections, book reviews. So I know it's a big question, but I was hoping each of you might talk a little bit about some of the differences in publishing in each of those genres. You don't have to talk about all of them, but there's a significant difference perhaps, between short stories and a novel,
Mm.
between a chapbook and a full-length poetry collection. So whoever would want to jump in there.
Well, the difference in publishers who publish short story collections and novels is not very great. I suppose there are a few publishers that I can think of, and there might be more than that I can't think of, that only do short story collections. Not very many. There may be more publishers who say we really only want to do novels because short story collections are a little harder to get reviewed or whatever. But among independent presses, I don't think very many say that either. So if they publish fiction, they're generally going to publish both. As far as literary nonfiction or creative nonfiction, if you want to call it, or memoirs, which I consider a part of creative nonfiction, but not all of it. Not every publisher publishes that. Some do specialize in it, but many independent presses, independent literary presses, publish creative nonfiction as well. So in my looking at publishers, I haven't very often had to look at a whole different realm of publishers. Now, when you get into university presses, and Christina is going to be the expert here, because I started looking at them recently, and there are precious few of them that actually do the type of creative nonfiction that is most commonly out there. But there are some who do a hybrid brand, and I've been discovering them. And so unfortunately, the research involved is another whole job.
Yeah.
It might take, another couple of days a week besides your writing. So Christina, it's really important to know the difference between university presses and independents for people to hear about that.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess one of the big differences, at least in my experience of both, would be that for university presses, they do have to submit external reviews or reports of the manuscript. So it goes through the stage of, it's not just, oh, the editor loves your book and whoever is working with the editor loves it too, and they decide to publish it, which is what I had with Four Way Books, which was great and amazing. It's an incredible press, by the way, a terrific press. But it's different at a university press because they do, as they do for scholarly books, they will generally send it out to outside readers to do reader reports. So I do know people who have been in the situation of, working with a long-term university press editor that had published their work for a long period of time. And then, for whatever reason, the editor just doesn't make a good decision sending it out to the outside readers. The outside readers come back, they're not into this book. And then that's the end, for the author, at least for that book. So I'd say that's a big, sort of a big difference right there, just in terms of the editorial process. The other thing I think is that university presses really do usually focus on their scholarly books. They're not as invested sometimes in promoting either the poetry books or the fiction books, simply because they're university presses and their main gig is going to be scholarly publishing. promotion and all that is something that we can talk about more and in more depth, I'm sure. But I'd say those are two of the big differences. And for me, I never actually pursued, directly either of these university presses. It was kind of with Northwestern University Press, it was sort of a word of mouth thing where the editor was interested in seeing my manuscript at the time. And then for University of Massachusetts Press with the Juniper Prize, it really was just sending in this manuscript like hundreds of other people are going to do. I had no interaction with any editors or anything like that until the book was chosen. So those are my ideas about some of the differences with university presses, and I haven't really pursued things like creative nonfiction so much with a university press, but it makes total sense to me what you're saying, Cris, that they might not be going for that, in part because it really is a limited subsection of what these university presses are usually doing. They're really putting so much more editorial time and effort and money into the scholarly side of things. Yeah, so.
You both have talked about within this conversation about this idea of promotion or in your introductions too. And, Cris, you talked about being your own advocate. Christina, you're saying about how university presses sometimes privilege the scholarly work more than others. So I'm curious, kind of a two-part question, I suppose, is the kind of strategies of promoting your work when working with independent presses and university presses, but also along with that, some of the pros and cons of working with independent presses. Some students might not have even thought about choosing between these, about these different kind of places, but there's a lot of choices to be made, of course, and differences in how active you are, in ways that I imagine impact your life as a writer and a promoter in many different ways. So yeah, I was hoping that you could each talk about that a little bit.
Well, first of all, I have recently come across a misuse of the term of independent publisher. I came across this somewhere online, somewhere on Facebook, where people were using the term independent publishing to mean self-publishing.
Oh.
And this is a really dangerous, I think, a dangerous misnomer, because it removes all the credibility from all of the literally hundreds, probably thousands of independent publishers there are out there who have dedicated their lives to doing this, whether they are for-profit or not-for-profit. They are putting out books on a smaller scale than a corporate publisher would or a commercial publisher would, but they're basically doing it in a very similar way. They may do 5 books a year, they may do 10 books a year, but they're still putting out books, working with distributors. They may be doing print on demand, but they still would have a distributor. They're still wanting their books to get reviewed. They're still wanting their books to be promoted. They're still entering their books in contests. So the business model does not include, well, I would be making these things up if I gave you examples because I don't have the experience, but the business model for an independent press doesn't include seeking or hoping for film options, before even accepting the book. It just doesn't include anything like that. And I don't think independent publishers ask for social media platforms to be highly developed before they, consider a book. If they love a book, they love a book. So there are those differences. Every independent publisher I've worked with has kept all of my books in print. There is now one exception in one that has disintegrated. And I'm finding that I can move it to another publisher's backlist, so it probably won't die. But every single one of those books, of my books, is in print, which is one of the things that independent publishers can offer their writers. What they can't offer their writers is a paid publicity tour, usually. When my Penn Nelson Ogren book was finally published, the publisher did hire a publicist who did set up a tour for me, but I drove it in my pickup truck. And the American Booksellers Association, which is not called that anymore, it was ABA, now it's BEA, books. What does that stand for? Booksellers of BEA. What is that? Anyway, so the American Booksellers Association magazine did a one-page thing on me, and the little title of it was Riding the Bookstore Highway, because I was just driving, and I drove from, where did I start? Pennsylvania, where I was the writer in residence, all the way to California, zigzagging across the country. Now, that's, I think, done by many people now, although I'm not sure as many people love driving as I do. And so I would still do that. I was planning to do that. Or speaking of publicity, how's this? Don't have a book published in fall of 2001 and don't have a book published in 2020. Two of them that got completely lost. I was planning a tour this past fall and it was wiped out. I'd like to hear what Christina has to say about promotion and publicity in poetry, because I don't know anything about that.
Well, first, I'll just second what you said. The best advice I can give anybody, don't publish a book in 2020, right? It's no longer viable advice for anyone. I have, with several of the presses that I worked with, I have worked with publicists that they had on staff, and I would say it really runs the gamut in terms of how much the publicists will do or are willing to do, or how reliable they may be. I've worked with some incredibly excellent publicists, or at least from my point of view, and I've worked with some who just really did not come through in terms of kind of holding their ends of bargains and things like that. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it does fall to the poet to be able to, make set up readings, make things happen in this way. A lot of things in the poetry world, do happen by word of mouth and just by, connections and networks that people have. And I imagine some of that's the same in the fiction world as well. But yeah, for sure, it is not something in my experience that anyone has ever done for me. It's something that either I've been able to have a somewhat or pretty reliable active partner in, or something that I basically had no partner in. And so living in a place like Chicago, it's not too difficult to talk to people, make things happen. There are lots of bookstores, different things that you can do, and also knowing people around the country who may have ideas or who want you to come read or whatever. But yeah, it certainly isn't something that I could say I was ever able to say to someone else, okay, just, please, if you wouldn't mind, just do this for me. It just doesn't work like that. And I don't really know anybody for whom that isn't at least somewhat true, that you do have to, to do some legwork.
Well, I'm glad that we can at least virtually celebrate your books today in this really bummer of a book promoting year. I know. And I'm so glad that we got to read both of them in classes too. And yeah, it's strange because in some ways Zoom allows us to connect with so many different readers, but that doesn't necessarily always translate into book sales as it does in the same. So again, for any latecomers, I just want to direct you to the chat and the links with both Cris and Christina's new work here too. One thing that I wonder, because you're saying that in an independent press sometimes, maybe 5 or 10 books will be coming out in a year, significantly less than in someplace like, Norton or Penguin or something like that, who have all these different categories. Do you feel like in that way you get a little bit more attention in a place like Coffee House or Four Way than perhaps you might elsewhere? And I'm also curious if you think that it affects the kind of work that you're able to do as an artist. Cris, you mentioned film options and things like that you don't necessarily have to be thinking about that, even if you are, but you don't have to be thinking about that as you're writing your work, submitting your work. Do you feel, I don't know, does it allow any more artistic integrity, do you feel like, or anything like that? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but yeah.
Well, because from the get-go, my work was called, I don't even like to call it, avant-garde, because I'm not a scholar of what that means. But it was always not conventional. It was considered unconventional work. And therefore I found a lot of support from independent publishers for that. But even more recently, my work I've started to format on the page, that how it looks on the page. And this is probably what poets go through all the time, but how it looks on the page is important to me. And I've started wrapping the text around text boxes and images. And I want it to look a certain way. And it's incredibly difficult for publishers online to do this with me. And I usually spend a lot of time back and forth with the web designers for online magazines doing this. And I don't even try to send these things to print magazines, literary magazines, because their pages are set how big they are and everything, nothing would work. But in the actual books, I spent two 8-hour days on the phone with one of my publishers, getting rid of all the formatting mistakes that happened when you send these things over. When you transfer documents, they get all messed up. And then, my most recent book had to have the page, it had to be a slightly larger format book. It had postcards in it. And so in order to read them, it had to be bigger. And then you had to make sure they got put in the right place. And so that publisher had to spend considerable time doing the text design. And I have found that with only one exception, and that was real early on when Coffee House wanted to give a new designer a chance to design a cover. That's the only time I ever had a cover that I hated. I've had a lot of input into my covers, and nobody has said no to my author photos, with the exception of one publicist who told me I couldn't cover my face with my camera, which is my current author photo. It's from here down, it's covered with my cameras there. She told me I couldn't do that. And I didn't like being told that there was something I couldn't do. And maybe that's why I've needed publishers who are willing to give me the extra attention that my work may need. I can't fault those who say, and they say it quite directly, we can't deal with this. Now, earlier in my career, when they were just saying it's just not commercial enough, part of me still has a lot of trouble with that, because I think they're deciding for the reading public what the reading public can and wants to read, and they're deciding for them by not publishing certain things, so I didn't have as much understanding for it then.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a book eventually finds its publisher, whatever the publisher may be. And, I don't think that any sort of big New York presses would have much interest in the work that I do personally. And in general, it's like they're not really open to looking at poetry anyway, or at least if they do, it's in an extremely sort of limited capacity that they will. So it's I'm not sure if the publisher or the publisher I have or might have is going to affect the work that I do, sort of from myself onto the page. It's more like I do the work and then it's going to be wherever it's going to be. And for example, Stardust Media seemed to me, I knew this was kind of a challenging, dense, book in a lot of ways. A lot of my poems are like that. um, a book that I just finished, about, half the book is about one sculpture in a church in Rome. The general reading public, they're just not, for the most part, that interested in somebody's obsession with one sculpture in a cathedral in Rome, right? And, yeah, I love what you're saying, Chris, this idea that, like, well, actually, maybe people would be. Like, maybe they don't know for sure. But, in terms of the categories that we have to work with, in terms of who your audience might be or might not be, it seems to just, my work at least seems to gravitate more towards the independent publisher or the university publisher in that respect. So
Thank you both. That's so helpful in thinking about these differences. And I just have one question for each of you separately before we kind of open this up to everyone else's questions. And kind of following through with that a little bit, Christina, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you think that the contest model affects contemporary poetry, whether in your own experience with contests through this new book, or just in general too, in the larger kind of publishing landscape. Yeah.
yeah, so again, I think that there are more contests than there used to be. And whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, my sense is that there are more people writing poetry than there used to be. And so some of these contests are, keeping up with the demand, or keeping up with the number of people who are willing to put their manuscript out there and pay a reading fee or whatever. I think that it can be a tough model, because you're sending out work. Usually it's just one manuscript that's chosen. Sometimes there are hundreds, sometimes there are thousands of manuscripts sent to these contests. And it can be dispiriting, for people. I think people do it sometimes because there aren't a lot of other options, especially if you're trying to publish a first book, right? So because if you may not have the wherewithal or kind of the connection or whatever, to send directly to a publisher who's not doing a contest. And so you're going to send to a lot of contests. And it can become expensive and time consuming, although I do think Submittable is making things not less expensive but less time consuming. Because you're not, in the old days you'd be going to the post office with all your envelopes. Now you're just getting on Submittable and clicking some things, and yeah, you still have to pay your fee, but you're getting a lot more out there in less time. So what I think is, that publishers just don't have the wherewithal to keep up with all the work that's out there. And so I think, even if these publishers were not doing contests and they were doing, say, 3 or 4 books a year in poetry or something like that, it still wouldn't be, though, then those selections would be kind of functioning like a contest. you know it's still just so much material, so much work out there, that it really feels a lot of times like there's just not enough outlets, even though there are a lot more than there used to be, to keep up with the demand. So one of the things that I try to tell people, and when students are sending out their first books and everything like that, is, be at least somewhat selective, in the sense of, if this is a press or a venue that's really only doing experimental work and your work is very lyric, for example, maybe that's not the best contest for you right now. Maybe you should be looking more at contests with previous book winners that seem like they're a little bit more in line with the aesthetics that you hold. But it's, I think that it's, again, there are, the good thing, right, is that there really are more opportunities than there used to be. But I suppose the bad thing is that even with that, people are still going to end up feeling frustrated, especially at the beginning, because it's a lot of sending with not a lot of returns. I just think this is a moment that we're in where we've had a kind of real growth of MFA programs and of PhD programs in creative writing, and it's a good thing, but there's not always enough publisher support to support all of the good work that's out there.
Thank you, Christina. I think there's even hearing that before sending books out about, yes, how many contests there are, but just the general proliferation to kind of temper expectations, and hearing, the amount of time that it takes to get a first book published, the sending it out for this amount of time, I think is so useful. And Cris, as you mentioned earlier, I know people would like to hear about the working with an agent, how one gets an agent, the kind of demands of working with an agent. And if you could talk to that a little bit, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Okay. It's kind of flattering that you're asking me that when I happen to know that some of the professors down there have far more experience than I do with agents, particularly Professor Shakar, who was my very first PhD student. And so I know he will have, so ask your professors, these questions too. You have to know some things up front about agents. And of course, the first thing you have to know about an agent is they need to make a living, and therefore they need to be able to make money on your book. And so you have to ask yourself and some of them will just say, I'm not accepting fiction anymore. It doesn't make any money. And so there are websites. I was just using one recently, but I don't remember what it's called, where they have agent profiles, and they'll tell you how to submit to them, what they're looking for, how to submit to them, and all of the procedures. So you need to find one of those websites and make sure you find one who seems right for your work and follow the guidelines for submitting. To do this, you're going to need a one-paragraph blurb that captures the essence of your book. This is just like the back of a book blurb, which I make my students write for the novels they're writing. It's very hard to do, and it's not an academic description. They have to describe their novels in an academic way in their job letters, but for a blurb, no, it's not done academically, and it's not a plot synopsis that goes on for 3 pages. What they want you to do is compare your book to other successful books. Those cliche blurbs that say, the love child of such and such and such and such. Well, go ahead and use something similar to that, but they also want to know how your book is different from the books that it's similar to. This is also required for proposals, by the way, fellowship proposals, grants, and university presses that want you to propose before you submit a book. And I've noticed that many agents are saying now that if they're not interested, you'll just simply never hear back from them. So keep track of when you send, and after 2 months, 3 months, cross it off. Send to 4 or 5 at once, send to 5 to 10 at once if you can. Keep track of it though. As soon as somebody's interested, you got to let the other people know. They'll start with a sample, and then if they're interested, they'll ask for the whole manuscript. I think that agents will ask for revisions very, very rarely will they just take it as is. And so with that, I would say, don't base any of your expectations on extraordinary success stories that you hear about other writers. How about, hope for the best and prepare for the worst? It could take a year, it could take more. And then once you get an agent, ask them how many places they plan to send the work to, because some will give up sooner than others. And once they give up, the manuscript is tainted for the New York arena. Another agent won't take it. Everybody's, people have seen it. They're not going to take it. And I've heard some agent horror stories that they want you to be beautiful. They want you to look like you would look good on a magazine cover or on a TV talk show or online. I hope those are just agent horror stories. But I've heard of some writers who have responded to agent horror stories by always having their picture on their cover letter. And then one person who actually put their picture of themselves not clothed on their cover letter. Now, these are just the stories you hear out there. I don't know. I don't know what people think about the putting your picture on your cover letter idea. Whereas, I always went with a more professional letter and tried not to look flashy. Any of you who work at your literary magazine there can probably tell stories about the awful kinds of cover letters people try to write in order to stand out, and they usually just get laughed at. So that's the great thing about working on a literary magazine. It teaches you that firsthand.
So you're saying we shouldn't all be sending nude photos with our cover letters? Okay, no, good. This is important.
No, you shouldn't.
Thank you both so much. I have a million other questions, but I want to open it up to everyone else here so we can have some other people's questions. You can either unmute, raise your hand, put something in chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
Could I just ask a question to start out? Thank you both. Incredible information, incredible talk. I'm just wondering how you know when a manuscript is ready to send either to an agent, to a contest, to a press. When do you know to stop sending it out to your friends for edits or suggestions and to stop tinkering with it, given that it costs money to send out to contests, it costs money to do all this. When's it time to send it?
This is probably a different answer. Maybe it's not a different answer for poetry and prose. I don't know, but you can't please every single friend you have. And so you can't keep doing everything that everybody tells you to do or suggests. When you're sending it to your friends and you're trying to see if the book works, I guess is your main thing. Does it work? Are they getting what I want them to get? And they give you the kinds of responses that you might have gotten in workshop in the past. You always have to ask yourself, why are they saying that, instead of just saying, I got to do all these things, make a list of everything everybody said and do them. Why are they saying that? Is there something fundamental somewhere else that's causing the comments you get? But yeah, you have to stop that after a while, because everybody is going to have a comment that no novel is perfect. I was once told no novel is finished, the writer just gives up. And so that's when you start sending it out, when you're ready to give up. But you also want to make sure it's clean. It doesn't have a lot of mistakes in it. And it's so much easier for people to leave mistakes in manuscripts these days because we don't proofread the way we used to, because we don't have to retype. And that seems silly to say nowadays, but I have my proofreaders more than I have my readers to make sure that the manuscripts are clean. Who wants to be distracted by mistakes? But I had a student just ask me the other day, what am I gonna, he's a PhD student, he's been with me for 5-6 years. What am I gonna do now without workshops? And I remember feeling the same way. And you just, you do have your friends, and you can make workshops out of people you've graduated with, but eventually you start to know, and you have to trust me on this. You do, you just start to know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I'm a super perfectionist when it comes to, getting to the point that I'm willing to send something out. And I don't have readers. I don't. I suppose for a lot of different reasons. I simply do not have other people read my manuscripts at all. So it's really me and the editor. And I am, to a certain degree, obsessed with the arrangement in a book of poems. And I could take, I mean, it's a little bit embarrassing to admit this, but I can take a whole summer just to arrange a manuscript. And that's just how it has to be for me in order to feel like I'm good to send it out. And I know one of the questions that Corey had kind of put out for us to look at when we were preparing for this panel was, what's the best advice you ever got about publishing, or publishing a book, or just publishing? And what's interesting for me is, I'm not a fiction writer, but the advice I always remember was from a fiction writer. And she said, if you don't believe in your work, who will? And it's almost like, to me, that's not just about being persistent. It's also about that feeling, right, that you have, that you've got this thing exactly up to where it needs to be, and you believe in it now, and then that's the moment. So that's what I would say.
Thank you both so much. Other questions? Janice, hop in there.
I'm actually asking this question on behalf of 2 graduate students who are interested in publishing poetry reviews. If you're just getting started with that, what would you advise them? They've written some reviews. What do they do with them next?
Well, I mean, there are a couple different pathways. One is the word of mouth pathway. If you have friends, or people, professors, or anyone who are involved with some journals that are publishing book reviews, that's certainly one way to do it. The other might be, honestly, just a search online, because there are now a number of literary reviews. I mean, one I'm thinking of right now is, say, Michigan Quarterly. I know that they consider reviews in the same vein that they might consider poetry of fiction. So that's kind of perfect if you have an already written review to send to a place like that, where they're considering already written reviews for their literary journal. There are certainly a number of publications now out there that do that. And again, Submittable makes it really easy. So I would suggest, either, talking to people, or, just querying friends, or, that you might have a friend who's doing some editorial work somewhere, or who is an editor or something like that, seeing if they might be able to use the review, or, simply sending it to a bunch of different literary magazines that can actually consider book reviews in that vein, rather than assigning them as such. So again, I can think of Michigan Quarterly. That's the first one that kind of comes to mind. For me, there are others. Maybe Boston Review might do some of that. But I think it's definitely worthwhile, putting it out there. And because Submittable makes it so easy, it is pretty easy to just, withdraw from any other publication that you had put the review out there for when another one takes it. So I'm hoping that's of at least some help.
Um,
you.
Also, Janice, I should just, I can send you some information. I'm a assignment editor. I'm a review assignment editor for American Book Review, and I never have enough reviewers for poetry. So, and I can also get books sent to reviewers. And so it's like a source of free books, and they also pay $50. So there's all these good things: free books, money. If I assign it, it's just about guaranteed to be published. The one big drawback, it takes a year to come out, easily a year. They are so far behind. But I'll try to remember to send you some info, and then all your students can just contact me and I'll put them on my list and we'll start sending them books.
That's wonderful and so generous. Thank you. Thank you, Cris. Yeah, the free books part of book reviewing is one of the very best parts. Absolutely. Amanda, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you so much to everyone who put this together and to our wonderful guests. One of the things that definitely struck me as you were both speaking is, sort of continuing to produce work and continuing to work despite a lot of rejection and despite maybe some hopeful moments that then turned into not so great moments for you. And also there was definitely, maybe the quiet part out loud, which is, okay, you're making art in a consumer capitalist society and culture that says that the value of something is based on the profit margin of people who can put it out into the world. So I guess it's kind of a bigger question and maybe kind of a, let me light my salt candles kind of a question, but what is it that sort of keeps you going and keeps you producing your art despite maybe some pushback or maybe this sort of broader cultural environment that is saying, it didn't get a six-figure inked deal and it's not being made into a movie, or, it's not being put on, I don't know, throw pillows or whatever and being sold at Target. What is it that helps keep you going? Yeah, just for all of us out there who are, continuing to push forward.
Well, I mean, I can repeat what fiction writer Pamela Painter once said in her fiction class. If you don't believe in your work, who will? It's really hard to get a sense of continuing intrinsic value in what you do, coming from your own self. But to a certain degree, it's what we all have to work towards and for. I realize that's a paradox, because by even talking about publishing and doing this publishing panel, we really are saying, yeah, publishing is important, and it is. But I do think part of the challenges, right? Part of the challenge of kind of doing the long haul of this kind of work is trying to separate your own sense of value from the world's sense of value for some of the same reasons that you just talked about. Because I mean, if we aren't going to try to instill some of these other values in ourselves and in the people we know and in the people who read the work that we do, how are these values that are other than capitalist, how are they going to survive? And so the work that we do may not be legible, by some kind of mass media, mass capitalist sort of consumerism, but in order to, I mean, we can't take that as the arbiter of whether or not something has value. Cris and I work in a department in which many of our literature colleagues are extremely focused on sort of the economic sides, kind of economic capital in literature. I've always just felt like, well, that's fine and it's interesting for some people, but that's not why I got into this, and so I think it's that difficult thing that we do in so many aspects of our lives, right? Of kind of figuring out who we are with respect to the people around us, to people who are trying to impose values on us, you know, who are maybe not understanding exactly what we do. And the fact is that misunderstanding, it doesn't even have to just come from people who absolutely have no caring or no understanding about literary, you know, matters or writing. It can come from within the field itself, you know? And so it's, you know, some of the people I most respect in our field have been the people who have really forged ahead independently over decades and decades of, you know, just not doing exactly what people could intelligibly put into a box. And by that, I'm thinking of, say, the poet Ed Roberson. You know, he's gotten a lot of attention now, but I mean, he really just published and worked for years with work that, you know, for a long time, people just didn't exactly know how to categorize it. And so I guess if you can find someone like that or people like that who you feel can inspire you in that direction towards a kind of independent value, it can be great. So I've talked too much, Cris.
Well, everything you said was great. It's giving me a lot of thoughts. And it's made me realize that people who don't people who have engaged in their writing career for reasons other than making money at it are the kind who don't give up, because and maybe people who are engaged in it in order to make money are the ones who might more likely give up if they don't get what they wanted out of it. So it must mean that somehow we're getting out of it what we intended or what we thought, or even surprise. Maybe we're getting surprise gifts from doing it. I recently finished a book. I was on sabbatical last semester, finished a book, and this semester I feel lost. I am not working on anything except, you know, reading my students' work and having my Zoom classes. And I sometimes feel like, well, who am I? I need to be working on something again. So obviously I'm getting something out of it. That famous quote, I think it was Flannery O'Connor, but correct me if I'm wrong. I hate writing, but I love having written. I almost feel the opposite of that quote. And I've just started feeling that way. I love writing and I hate being finished with a project and having the you know, having to start over. So I see a lot of hands now, so I'll mute myself and wait for another comment.
Thank you both so much, and thank you for that question, Amanda. That was wonderful. I see 3 hands. So Maddie, and then JP, and then Liz, and then a question came in chat after that. So Maddie, go for it.
Hi, I wanted to ask either of you a question about something I remember you mentioned earlier when you were discussing sending your work out to be published and sort of talking about how publishers tend to decide for the public what should be published and what should be read versus what is not. And I was interested in that in a slightly different way with, I was just wondering how you as writers sort of choose what of your work to send out. Like, do you do any deciding on what you think should be viable for the public versus what you keep for yourself? Because I myself, like, I mostly do confessional poetry, which, side note, Sylvia Plath's niece just followed me on Twitter 20 minutes ago, so I'm freaking out about that. But besides that, I'm okay with sharing literally anything for the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it might be considered publishable. So I'm curious what you think about what you decide of your work should be for the world versus what you keep for yourself.
I don't think I've ever kept anything for myself, to tell you the truth. Not even the journals I wrote in college. In 2014, my memoir, Something Wrong with Her, includes images of pages of my journal in college. So I decided that was going to be public as well. might as well because it was a completely different person. But the concept of writing just for myself is not something, even though I don't write with the goal of money, I don't really write only for myself either. That's just something I don't relate. I mean, I understand if people want to do it. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but I don't relate to it very well. And so everything that I'm working on is eventually I'm going to choose some places to send it. Christina, have you ever had things that you worked on purposefully not to send anywhere?
Yes. And I'll talk about it just briefly in the context of a book, of a poetry book, because what I was saying before about arrangements and putting things into the book and having a very perfectionistic eye about arrangement of books. There can be a poem that I loved or that I really saw as intrinsic to the project even of the book, and putting everything together, I see that it keeps sticking out like the proverbial sore thumb no matter where I try to place it. And in that case, it's not going into the book. Sometimes it might have been published, in a magazine or a journal or something like that. But if it doesn't fit the scope of the book, it's out. And what's been really interesting is that in the last couple books I've done, a couple of the poems that I really felt were formative, to the whole kind of wellspring of the manuscript ended up getting thrown out, for that reason. So I guess I'm willing to sacrifice something to the greater good if the greater good is a book that somehow cannot make room for this thing, whatever it is. But in terms of keeping things for myself, I spent so much time doing that when I was younger that I don't really think in those terms anymore much myself either. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, you too. It's interesting thinking about maybe not an evolution, but just a change in publishing when one stops thinking of writing for oneself and only framing it around sharing and publishing it. That's something we don't talk about a lot, I think, in the classroom. I have JP and then Liz, and then we'll get to your question in chat, Violet, after that.
Hi, first I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to present on publication and all that encompasses, and also sharing your publishing and writing journeys as well. I think that's definitely an aspect that I personally really appreciate. I know this whole talk has been focused on publishing specifically, but I think my question actually relates more to writing in general. And the question specifically is, how did you both get into writing? How did you develop your interest in writing over time? And I guess maybe another way to term the question is why do you write what you write?
I think Cris is talking, but she's muted.
No, I wasn't talking.
I thought you were. Okay, I'll go.
You can go.
So, I mean, all I could say about myself really is that I've always been a literary person. I've just always been somebody very interested in literature and reading and writing. I ended up, getting a doctorate in literature, in comparative literature, in English, French, and Italian, before I ever, published a single poem. And I was doing that thing that we were just talking about, is, writing for myself with poetry and writing for some kind of scholarly public in the prose that I was writing. And at a certain point in my scholarly development, I started taking a poetry workshop, and all of a sudden I just knew this was something I had to do. And so, I think it was less of an aha moment. A lot of times, when you go to dinner with people, they'll say when was the moment that you first knew that you wanted to be a writer or a poet, or what was the one poem that made you feel like you had to be a poet or writer? And I'm always really bad with those kinds of questions because I feel like it was more of an accretion, you know, of interest and writing. And you know, I loved, when I was writing my dissertation, I loved writing about all the poems I was writing about. I loved being in that workshop and writing poems, you know, for other people for the first time. And it just all ended up coming together. Not very dramatic, but.
You're right. That's a hard question. But it made me realize that, and maybe me more than you, Christina, although I don't know exactly when you were in college. When I was in high school and college, of course, there was zero internet. And so when you weren't actually with other people, you were alone. And therefore, I was alone a lot. I didn't do a lot of going out. I didn't party. I didn't have a lot of friends. And so I was alone a lot. And so who was there to talk to but myself? And so I had this manual typewriter in my room, and I know for a fact that I drove the rest of my family crazy because it was constantly rat-a-tatting throughout the house. And that's how I felt connected with anything, even though I wasn't writing things that anyone was going to see. I wasn't writing letters. I was, you know, I was venting like a teenager would. But that act made me, I want to say made me feel, and then there's a blank. I don't know what it made me feel. That's where that I existed, maybe something like that. And I wonder now, sometimes, you know, people are so much in contact from, you know, texting and social media and everything else. And I wonder, are people getting the same kind of feedback or emotional support from that kind of writing, even if it's one sentence, instead, because it's there, because there is somebody who's going to respond, whether they like it, whether they just click like, or whether they actually respond. You know, you're getting the same sort of thing out of it. So you know, and this is completely a different subject from what you asked, by the way, but it has to do with earlier questions when Christina was talking about being patient, or you know, it's going to take sending your book to a lot of places. Don't become impatient because the technology is there and just post your work online somewhere. That's you know, I know it's easier, but pretend that it's not there. And you know what, I wonder about my undergraduates. I ask them, are you ever just alone? Are you ever alone where you can just think your own thoughts? Those are the times when whether or not you're meant to be a writer is going to come through.
Thank you both so much. Great question, difficult question. Liz, jump in there.
Hi, thank you both so much for spending time with us this afternoon. I'm afraid I'm not going to make this much easier in terms of questions, but what I'd like to ask speaks a little bit back to Amanda's wonderful question from earlier. As MFA students, we're told a lot that the only way to get a first book is to win that first book prize, and you both addressed this earlier. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what that says about poetry publication in terms of access and availability, and what that means for people who might not be in the place or have the time to make such connections. Just, do you have any insight that you could speak to about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that, yeah, if you're in the position of trying to publish your first book and you're dealing with all these contests, and it really can feel like a thankless task, for sure. And it's true that some people might not have the same access, and it also feels like it might be rigged against somebody like that who might not have that access. I guess by the same token, I would also say, and this goes back to the technology question, because of the widespread availability of the internet, these contests are available to more people than they used to be in the past. In other words, you can put in a search and search for poetry first book contests, and you can find, a multitude of first book contests that might come up as a result of that search. And you don't have to be anyone special or anyone in particular to be able to do that. So again, I kind of think that the internet and the technology has opened access a little bit. If someone's interested and they're willing to do a search, they can find access to these places. I'd also say that by being in an MFA program to begin with, you're already in a situation where you're going to have a little bit more access to more resources than someone who was not in one of these programs. I think it's a lot harder for someone who has been, let's just say, writing on their own, to be able to kind of get into the mindset of even knowing what step one might be in a situation like that. I think that one of the great things about being in an MFA program is that it gives you a little bit more latitude and a little bit more community in terms of figuring out, are there people you can ask, different things? Again, are there people, for example, you yourself or someone, one of your friends or your classmates who works, for a literary magazine, who can kind of give you some avenues or some, some things. One thing I'd say, and this is a weird way maybe to bring this up, is like, make sure that you do events, that you do all the readings that you can. And it might be, readings with, your cohort, your classmates, and, whatever kind of reading that is, it really can make a difference. That's how I ended up publishing my fourth book, Perception. There was an editor from Four-Way in the audience when I was doing a reading of a completely unpublished manuscript, and she wanted it. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in every case, but the more you're out there and circulating the work, the easier it becomes. And I would say also, the more you publish in literary magazines, also the easier it becomes. It's not a guarantee of anything, but it just opens up your circle a little bit, so that you have more access to more people who, maybe might take an interest in what you're doing and can direct you in particular ways. So keep being active. I know it's just so hard during COVID. It's like, it's so hard. But just make sure, that's, people told me that at the beginning too, and I didn't really believe it. But it turned out to be really true for me. The more you're active, whatever that may be, publishing individual poems, doing readings, doing events, the easier it all gets. So,
I had never heard, and I don't know if it's true, Christina, you can maybe speak to this. I hadn't heard that for poets, the best or first line of attempt should be contests. Almost every contest has a entry fee that's more than $3. And so I don't know that I would not be recommending that to fiction writers, even though I think far fewer contests exist for that. I do think that poetry first book contests are more numerous than for prose, for fiction. But and again, we can keep talking about the way people used to do it, even last year or the year before, when they would be able to, for example, walk around AWP and look at publishers and look at the books and see what kind of publisher would be right for you, by looking at their books, by even reading their books. You can do this in bookstores, or you used to be able to go to the poetry section and see what they have there. Go to poetry readings and look at the books and see who the publishers are, and so what certain publishers are publishing. It can be overwhelming to try to do that online, but there are, if you know how to use Submittable, there's ways to use the filters there where you can search for the right kind of publisher, even if it's looking for a publisher who's interested in marginalized identities, and or writers who are not in academic programs. There may be calls for manuscripts out there that have that on them. So you can find that out by filtering the Submittable Discover thing, which is not a thing I love to do. That Submittable Discover, turn off the deadline thing, and so you can see a more variety of work. And if you don't find something there, you can also try, what is that other place that it doesn't let you submit, but it gives you a database, Submission Grinder. It's a place that lets you keep a record of your submissions, and it lets you search for places to submit, but it doesn't do the submitting for you like Submittable does.
Thank you both so much. And originally this panel was supposed to do that in some ways, and so that I'm hoping that, especially in the future, maybe this is something that's reproducible too, that we can have this event at the public library and have more people outside of the community too. I think we should probably end with Violetta's question. Let's see, Violetta asked, now that you're an established writer, why not self-publish? Is self-publishing viable as a solution?
It's actually not something that I'm really interested in. And I had a student who had done quite a bit of self-publishing, at least 2 or 3 books, and he gave a little presentation to my publishing seminar when I had it a couple of years ago. And he was a great presenter because he told us all the things he did wrong when he self-published his books. And there are actually people out there now who make a living or part of a living on doing the technological setup of self-published books. So it's something that not everybody can do, apparently. If you do it wrong, for example, your words might slide into the gutter of the book. I'm doing this with my hands and you can't even see me. Your words will slide into the gutter of the book. Or the cover will be slid around, because Amazon doesn't care that you've turned it in wrong. They're just gonna churn out whatever you turn in, and so I don't trust myself enough, even though I've learned a hell of a lot about making my way around a computer and formatting my own work. It's amazing to me, by the way. When one of my books was being turned into a book for Kindle, I was told, well, you can only have 30 images. And after that, we're going to cut them out. And you can only have, so many fonts. And after that, it's going to all be the same. And I thought, wait a minute, I thought technology could do anything. Why is it that I can do more at my age and just on a desktop PC than you can do at Amazon? So that's another reason why I am not going to go in for it. Despite, again, you hear these miraculous success stories, but that's a one in, how many million story. So it hasn't tempted me so far. Print on demand is different because my publishers take care of making sure the book looks like it's supposed to look.
Yeah, so whenever this question comes up, you know, inevitably somebody says, well, Walt Whitman self-published, and it's true. But, you know, in a way, my way of thinking about self-publishing, it connects to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, you know, writing for yourself, or, you know, writing for yourself and your friends. To me, that's more what self-publishing is about. And, you know, that can be a perfectly fine way to distribute work if that's what you're interested in. You know, for me, I'm not interested in it because I would like to have, I'd like my work to be sponsored by some outside publisher. You know, an independent publisher, a university publisher, or whatever. I've seen it, you know, work nicely for people who, you know, again, wanted to distribute things amongst their friends and family, or, you know, things of that nature. And that's kind of cool. I mean, you know, it kind of takes you back to, you know, 17th century, you know, folios and things like that were being passed around. And there's something kind of wonderful about that. But for me, for what I'm doing, I'm not particularly interested in it. So, and I should say, in addition to that, I really should say that, you know, being a faculty in the PhD program in creative writing at UIC, it's, you know, incumbent upon me to make sure that students are, you know, pursuing publishers that could be looked at in some way on the academic job market. Self-publishing is not. You know, so again, it really depends on what you want to do with your published material.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for all these wonderful questions. And if we can all just briefly maybe unmute and thank Cris and Christina for their generosity and their knowledge. Just a little round of applause.
Yay.
And I hope everyone will join us again this evening at 5 when we'll get to hear their own work. And if you have questions about the work of Christina Pugh and Cris Mazza, there'll be a brief Q&A after the reading this evening. So go refresh, recharge. Thank you again, Cris and Christina, and we'll see you in a couple hours.